Welcome back. Well, in the first segment, I talked about the shotgun and how to go about selecting a good shotgun for yourself, one that fits you, and I explained the differences in lengths of shotgun tube, and I gave you a brief explanation about what chokes in a shotgun tube do, what the bead is in reference to the sighting plane, and how this is your rear sight really. One thing I didn't touch on, I did mention that target shotguns will have a middle bead. Well, that's basically to provide a little bit of English. Most trap shooters and target shooters prefer to have a little bit of an upward throw to their pellets. Now this is just a preferential thing because this is the way trap shooters and many target shooters operate. They want to be able to see the bird in flight, so oftentimes the bird, rather than blotting the bird out as you would instinctively do with a shotgun on a pheasant or a partridge, you would basically track the bird with the bead slightly under, and the rear bead is a smaller bead, and it basically sits like a figure 8 underneath the front bead. So that basically gives you a little bit of upward English to shoot up, cast your shots up a little bit, and to reach a bird which is flying a little higher over your front bead than a hunting shooter would. It's not a advantage to a hunter. A hunter should have, it's not, in other words, it's not an upgrade to have that bead. So don't go taking your hunting piece and having a middle bead put on it, because it's really not there for that reason. It's there so that a trap shooting shotgun oftentimes has a slightly different height comb to place the shooter's eye naturally a little bit higher, so he's looking down on that ramp and seeing that rear bead and the front bead in relationship to one another. So that's all that's about. So I want to talk about the chambering and the choke and the shells that go into these shotguns and how they work. First of all, the gauge. What is gauge? A gauge is actually something which a machinist will use to measure, measure a distance between two objects or something like that. In the case of shotguns, at some point in the history of shotguns, it was devised a measurement of the inside diameter of a shotgun bore. In other words, the primary part of the bore in front of the forcing cone, which is a tapered section of the chamber just in front of the shot shell, and it's between the choke, which is a constriction of the bore that I spoke of. Well, and this, don't confuse, this is not when we're talking about lead, we're not talking about a projectile. But the gauge that was used was a pure lead round ball of a fraction of a pound. So a 12 gauge shotgun means it's a pure lead round ball, perfectly round sphere lead ball that is 1/12 of a pound. So there'd be 12 of them to the pound. If you had a bag of 12, that would be 1 pound, and one of those balls would slip down that bore with a perfect fit. So that's where 12 gauge came from. And 20 gauge is a smaller ball because it's 1/20th of a pound, and 10 gauge is larger because it's 1/10 of a pound, and so forth. If you had a 1 gauge shotgun, it would be one round lead ball that would fit down that tube. So that's all that gauge means. Constriction of the bore is something which has been standardized through the years, so that each manufacturer, when they say improved cylinder, they're all talking about the same constriction of the bore in terms of actual size of the exit point of the actual exit point of that shot coming out is going through a tube that has been constricted to a specified amount for each degree of constriction, whether it be the least degree of constriction, which is having none whatsoever, that's a cylinder bore, having a slight degree of constriction, which is one of the skeet 1 or skeet 2, having then improved cylinder, then modified, then full, and then extra full, and so forth. And there's graduations in between, as I said. But we understand now what gauge is. When we talk about the chamber size, we're talking about 2 3/4 inch, 3 inch, 3.5, and so forth. These are chamber sizes which have been standardized as time went on for various uses. 2 3/4 inch was a great improvement over earlier shot shells which had much shorter chambers. There was no standardization years ago, but there were 2-inch chambers, there were 2.5-inch chambers and such. And at one time, shot shells were simply made so that there was powder in the bottom, and somebody put what they called a nitro card, which is a fireproof paper that went on top of the powder, and that basically propelled that. It was a thick cardboard wad, maybe about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch thick, or it might have been a piece of almost like a fiber, like masonite type of thing that was on top of the nitro card, and then the shot on top of that, and that didn't require much length at all. But then it became evident to the industry that one of the problems was that the pellets. And here's a bag of shot right here. This is number 7.5 that I use for my target load. They come in 25-pound bags, but it was discovered fairly early on that pellets, in the process of being, accelerated down the bore, soft lead pellets tended to deform on each side that they contacted something, whether it was the side of the bore or to one another. So in this crushing episode where they were being thrust down the bore suddenly and accelerated, there was a lot of deformation, and it basically imparted odd shapes to the pellets and caused them to fly off kilter. So just as any baseball player knows, is that the stitching allows him to control the stitching on that ball. The pitcher can control the flight of that ball by imparting different types of spin to that stitching. So, well, that's what happens with shot pellets. As they become deformed, they become more radical in the way they fly. So they basically all come out flying like knuckleballs. That's basically what happens with lead pellets, especially when they're all knuckleballs to begin with. They all want to just fly kind of on their own. But when you throw in the added quotient of deformities on each side, and they're all being different in the way they're deformed, then it becomes more crucial to protect that from happening. So back along about I got one here. I got a box here. This goes back to I'm going to guess probably around the early 60s. Imagine that. This says here, all new plastic Mark V Super X by Winchester Western Olin. Now, at that time, these shells were brand new. Everything up until that time had been paper shells. I have some paper shells here. This is a 20 gauge. These are old antiques, and I don't have any intention of even opening the box to show you one, because I don't want to ruin the box flap. But this is, paper shells. Paper shells have not been gone that long in my lifetime. When I started shooting shotguns and loading shot shells for myself, I was dealing with paper tubes. That was the order of the day. So it wasn't until probably the mid to late 60s that plastic became the most common form of shot shell. So they haven't been around all that long. Of course, to many of you, that's probably a long time ago. But in terms of my own lifetime, I can remember when they were still very, very common. But with every improvement to the shot shell was a dramatic increase to its effective range, because they increased the hardness of the pellets so that they had less deformity. Eventually, they even incorporated such things as copper-plated shot to really improve their resistance to deformation in the bore. They came out with protective collars, plastic collars that were inserted into the shell, and then eventually to one-piece one-piece wads, which eliminated the need to have a stack of fiber, and they even used horsehair wads and all sorts of stuff. Just basically, they had different forms of compression and different thicknesses and fire resistance. So when they came out with the one-piece wad, it improved production capabilities for the companies, and it also improved basically the cushioning of those pellets down the bore. Now, with 2 3/4 inch shells, that was a drastic improvement. That was probably the zenith of everything when it came to shot shells, and it still probably remains that way for the mainstay. If you're talking about a shotgun that's going to be used for virtually all upland game, for small game, rabbits, squirrels, and birds, partridge, quail, doves, pheasants, 2 3/4 inch shells of any gauge is more than sufficient. You have more than enough payload to take down any of those animals without any difficulty whatsoever. So you're going to notice as I'm talking about this stuff that there's a constant tension in shotgun shells between having enough and having too much. That's always a constant tension. One of the biggest problems that we're dealing with a shotgun is that it's immediately a short range gun. We're talking in terms of less than 60 yards, dramatically less than 60 yards if you really want to have an efficient gun. Often people don't quite understand how poorly a pellet retains its energy in flight. A pellet that starts out, now this is top velocity for, shotgun shells range from a low of about 1150 feet per second velocity for, say, a youth load, for a person just starting out, to upwards of 1,330 feet per second, and sometimes more for a maximum load for pheasants and things like that in open cornfields. So, but if you talk about the largest size shot typically used for a pheasant, which would be open fields, number four pellets traveling from the muzzle at 1,330 feet per second. At only 40 yards away, which is the typical downing distance for a pheasant, out in the open when that would be a relatively close shot, 40 yards away for a pheasant. We've dropped from 1,330 feet per second to 815 feet per second. That's not as fast as most of the air guns, the pellet rifles that you buy when you go to Walmart. So that's a very, very sluggish velocity at that point. So what's it doing at 60 yards rather? At 60 yards, that number 4 shot is dropped down from 815 at 40 yards to 685 feet per second at 60 yards. And you can just see how rapidly that's taking a nosedive in velocity. You have barely enough energy for that pellet to get all the way into the vitals. So it's not about, with a shotgun, it's never about shooting as far as you can. Absolutely not, because you simply don't have enough velocity. And one thing I didn't tell you was what's the energy of that? We talk in terms of like a ton. We use like references of a ton of energy when it comes to a 30-06 and things like that. 1.5 tons of energy. Well, if you take number 4 shot, which is a very large pellet for pheasants, the energy of that at 20 yards is only 7.3 foot-pounds of energy. 7.3. That's all. We're not talking about hundreds of foot-pounds of energy or thousands of foot-pounds of energy. We're only talking about 7.3. At 40 yards, that pellet is only putting out 4.8 foot-pounds of energy. At 60 yards, 3.4 foot-pounds of energy. There's no energy whatsoever left in a pellet when you get out to 50 or 60 yards. So its ability to drive in deep is all about pellet size and therefore pellet weight. Now, pellet sizes go all the way from that, in numerical terms, they go all the way from number 2s, the larger one above number 2 would be BB. But now we're getting into goose and duck stuff, which I'm not going to deal with because that's all about non-toxic shot. So I'm going to stick with just lead shot and get to the basics for the time being. We'll talk about non-toxic shots, so-called steel shot later on, which is actually not steel at all, it's a soft iron. But that's a whole nother chapter. But in terms of lead shot, typically number 4 shot is about the largest recommended for any birds that are flying around America. Very rarely number 2s would ever be needed. Number 4 shot would be a good shot size on extended shots on pheasants in an open cornfield. They have enough size and density to still be able to get in deep because they have a greater driving force and energy than a smaller pellet would have. I shouldn't have closed this page here because I can give you an example of what that difference would be. And remember, the size also increases the wounding capability, just as if it was a bullet. This is a little miniature bullet for a bird or a squirrel. If you take number 7.5, which is a perfectly good shot size for, say, quail up close, to bring down quail are very small. They're smaller than my fist. At 40 yards away, number 8s are only delivering 1.1 foot-pound of energy, each pellet 1.1. If you go up to number 7.5 to get a little bit more energy, you're only up to 1.4. Number 6s, 2.5. So you see that number 6, because of its size and density, that's why the number 6 pellet was so popular for so many years. You could go into most shotgunners, shooting cabinets, and you could find nothing but number 6s on hand. He maybe in the old days he may have, when lead shot was still permissible for waterfowl, you might find number 6s for everything, and he had number 4s for ducks and number 2s for geese. And on occasion you would see that he would have some so-called low brass and high brass. Well, what does that mean? It's a visual term these days. In the old days, the connotation was that the high brass was a stronger construction, and low brass was a weaker construction to go along with the relative power inside of that case. But that's really not true anymore because internal pressures are virtually the same in one packaging to the other. You can have high velocity, 1,300 foot per second. These are high velocity, 1,300 foot per second low brass cases. These have got very high pressure, very fast burning red dot powder and things. So it's really not to do with the internal construction and strength so much as it is to do with just the visual reference. A person who goes afield and he's got shells in his pockets for different things, he can pull them out and he says, oh, I got low brass here, that's when I'm going into the woods. And he comes out into the cornfield and he takes out his high brass, so a little bit, because it's just a different load, that's all. He knows that the high brass is giving him his 1,300 feet per second or 1,340 or something like that. And his low brass is giving him somewhere around 1,220. So because he doesn't need to blow his partridge up when he's taking him at only 20 yards away. Okay, I want to go back and reiterate what I said earlier, is that it's about pellet size in order to keep up energy, but and it's also pellet size when it comes to actual tissue destruction to bring a bird down of appropriate size, or a squirrel or whatever, a rabbit or whatever it is. But as pellet size goes up, there's no free lunch with shotguns. That's the one thing that became apparent to everybody, is that there's no free lunch. As you go up in shot size, now you have to reckon with the fact that you're going down in pellet count. So, where you had before in a given circle, maybe a circle 6 inches in diameter, with one size pellet with number 7s, 7.5, you might have 6 or 8 pellets. But as you go up to number 6s, you might only have 3 or 4 pellets. So those are at a given range. So that's the sort of thing that you have to reckon with, is the fact that your pattern gets more and more sparse as the pellet count goes down, as the shot size goes up. So you have to always keep that on balance. For the guy who's throwing number 4s way down range, it sounds great that he's got a little bit more energy, but he's got a lot fewer pellets when he's shooting number 4s way down range. So some guys will say, well, I'd still rather stick with my number 5s and try to get my shots off a little bit quicker. I alluded to this, when you have a shotgun, there are no absolute rules. Nobody can ever really nail down. It's like nailing jello to a tree, as they say. You can't really nail down any specific rules, and that's because there are too many variables. The variables are all over the place. First of all, you don't know where the bird's going to come up. That's a big who knows. You don't know where the rabbit's going to be coming from. You don't know how high the squirrel is going to be in the tree. So these are all the things that influence all the best laid plans of mice and men when it comes to shotguns. You can never compute it all. The other thing that becomes apparent is that everybody's individual shooting style can be quite varied. In a group of a line of 3 pheasant hunters going out with a pointer, you can have 3 different shooting styles very easily. You can have one guy who's very quick on the wing, another guy who's about average, another guy who's very, very slow. And they can all have the same. They can all take the same number of pheasants home the same day, but they do it in a different way. This guy over here might be extremely fast. The bird popped up, bang! He just he instinctively, he's good on the wing. He can throw that shotgun to his shoulder, and with one cool shot, he brings down the pheasant 25 or 30 yards away. So this guy knows that he will butcher a pheasant if he doesn't go afield with something relatively small in shot size, like number 6s, and with an improved cylinder chamber. Now that violates the standard rules. Most people would say, most manufacturers would say, well, that calls for a modified choke, or maybe even a full choke or something for open cornfields. But this guy here, if he was shooting at that pheasant in his shooting style with a modified and certainly with a full choke, he'd have lead to eat for dinner that night. So that's not the sort of thing, and it would be butchered meat. If you've ever seen a pheasant, blown up at close range, you'd know what I'm talking about. You can go on YouTube and see it all the time, where pheasants take off and somebody they don't hold on just a couple of seconds longer, let that bird get out there, and they pull the trigger too quickly, and all you see is it looks like a pillow being blown up. So that's not edible fare, and it really ruins your day if that's your nice cock pheasant that you just shot. So everybody has to take into account that circumstance. So when it comes to choke, modified choke with a 28-inch bore is the recommended average standard for that sort of shooting, but it's not an absolute, and neither is the shot shell that goes in it. So you have to kind of take your own shotgun and do some shooting at a trap range, with some number 7.5s, or maybe get yourself a buddy who can help you out and fire some birds for you. You can do it for each other. I do it all the time with my buddy. You fire some birds left and right, straight out, and you can set the machine up way out in front of you, 25 or 30 yards, and use a pull cord. And you have to be very careful, because somebody's got to keep walking out there and changing it, unless you have some sort of a ballistic shield so that the person can sit behind it and make your own, kind of fabricate your own sort of a trap house, that sort of thing. But you want to have some understanding of what your ability is in the field, and you can get that understanding very, very quickly by becoming proficient with a clay bird. Now understand the vital difference, though. A clay bird's maximum velocity is right as it comes out of that throwing arm. When it's being thrown out, that's the bird's maximum velocity, and from that point on, just like the shot, that bird is no longer under propulsion, and it's going to come down. It's just going to fall down to the ground very soon, in a very short trajectory. A winged bird is totally different. A winged bird, his quickest velocity is after he speeds up. He has to accelerate with his wing power. He has to speed up. So when he first flushes, usually his best defense is he'll cackle and he'll make all kinds of noise to basically to throw you off. And you know that can, for a person who's the uninitiated wing shot, that can jar you for a second. All of a sudden you have a and that can really get you so that you a second or so behind getting your shotgun up. So he's bought himself a little bit of time. But remember, he has to accelerate, and so he's speeding up as the shot is slowing down and getting less efficient. But just the same, you want to get out with your clay pigeons, and you want to get a notion of what your capabilities are, how quick you are, and try to develop some, you know, at first you want to do the American Trap Association thing and get the gun mounted and say pull, and you know, have time to get on target and things like that. But in the game shooting world, you're going to be walking along with your shotgun at port arms, or up on your shoulder or something like this safely, whatever is appropriate, or maybe down here. And as you're walking along, all of a sudden that cackle is going to come up, and he's going to be flustering you. You need to be able to just mount it and shoot. So that's how you want to progress with your trap shooting. You want to be able to get to the point where you can your buddy can call the shots. You don't call. You don't say pull. He just simply all of a sudden, you know, he'll say, "Are you ready?" Yep. It might be a 3 count. It might be an 8 count. It might be a 5 count. It might be anything. And all of a sudden you just shoot. And you don't know whether the bird's going to be going left or right, because he can set up that trap so that the bird veers in one direction or another. So you got to do that. Those are the fun things to do. And you'd be surprised how quickly you can develop shooting skill with a simple trap like that, with a Trias trap. You can develop some incredible shooting skill where you can snap shoot, where you can, as soon as that bead comes up, you slap that trigger. You never, as I mentioned before, you never aim a shotgun. You point a shotgun, just like you say there. You point it and pull the trigger. And you slap the trigger. You just pull the trigger back. You never squeeze the trigger, because that means you're aiming. You just pull that trigger back when the time is appropriate. And I'm going to talk about correct shooting style again a little bit later on, and talk about follow through and how you maintain a correct lead through a target, an instinctive lead, I'll call it, because you know I get nauseated by all these different charts that even Lyman has had in the past. They've had charts of you know, how far ahead you have to lead a particular bird. Like if it's a mallard duck, you got to lead at so many feet, at so many yards. If it's a pheasant, if it's going at 30 degrees, you got to lead it this far. I'll tell you what, you know, nobody goes afield with that kind of that sort of computer in their head. It boils down to this: it's instinctive. As that bird is coming up, you just simply flow the bead right through and pull the trigger, and that's how it's done. So I'm going to go into the mechanics of shooting the shotgun in the later episodes, but I just want to talk about now the shell, the all important shell. When you're picking out your shotgun shells, there's certain standards that you can kind of maintain. Target loads are very good for target shooting for a number of reasons. If you're a reloader, you can use any kind of shot shell for targets. I mean, you can use heavy, high velocity ammo for target shooting, except you can't do that on most trap ranges. Most trap ranges will restrict you to nothing larger than number 7.5, because they have distance rules. They don't want to have those pellets flying too far down range. They have a restriction of how far they want those pellets to stay, and also to the destruction effect. In other words, what it does on vegetation, because sometimes those pellets, when they start striking vegetation that is out of the standard range, it'll start defoliating them. But if you're just out by yourself and you're in a meadow and you want to try out this stuff, you can try any kind of shot size you want. Keep in mind that clay pigeons they're only about a 1/2 inch thick, and they're only, I can't remember the exact diameter, the 3.5 inches or whatever. But whatever the diameter, they're very small. There's not much mass there, and to be able to strike them, you have to have a pretty full pattern of pellets at any given range in order to bring them down. So what has become standard for target shooting for practice is a 1 1/8 ounce of shot, and it's packaged in a very durable container. These cases have been technologically devised to give the reloader maximum number of reloads. I've reloaded some of these things, a dozen times or more before the mouths start getting so charred from being burned that they will no longer hold a good crimp. And also too, the mouth starts getting so large. My dad and I used to we used to extend the life of them by taking a drop of paraffin. We'd take a drop of paraffin and put it at the end there to keep the pellets from rolling out. That's what we used to do. And some people have taken a piece of, cut circles of paper or something, or they take what they used to call a nitro card and put it on top of the pellets. But that's really not recommended because that can blow a hole in your pattern. That card can stay there in the pellets. Basically, there'll be a vacant space in your pattern. So it's best not to use any over-the-shot cards. And in some cases, over-the-shot cards can actually increase pressure if you're using high pressure loads. But that's the standard, is to get so-called target loads. They come packaged, and they'll say usually in the packaging whether they're this one here is for sporting clays. What makes that different than a trap load? Well, a trap load, that would be excessive velocity for the rules under the American Trap Association. You can't use high velocity 1,300 foot per second loads for trap shooting, but you can for sporting clays. If you want to put up with the punch, these have got significantly more recoil. A lot of sporting clay shooters will have different loads for different things. For the guy who's approaching the station, which is the woodcock station, where the birds just jump up straight in front of him, he doesn't need to have the 1,300 foot per second load. So you don't have to abide by all these caveats, anyways. But this is, whether it's a Winchester hull, the so-called AA hull is a very famous. They're really the ones that perfected the AA. Is the one that perfected the long-lasting shell for many reloads. These have been reloaded. Right here, you can see there's some charring of the paper, the plastic tube, even down to the sides here. But this has already been reloaded for 6 times. So there's no evidence of any. There's no evidence of any notching or anything like that on the fraying of the case. So they're still good for a long time, and they can get pretty ugly after a while. Now, a standard so-called high brass shell is actually made to be weaker. It's made to deteriorate quicker. These target shells have got a brass case. I should say a brass head, and that really is not even, the only reason that brass is there is basically for extraction and to hold the battery cup primer, and that's the type of primer it's called, is a battery cup primer. It's a primer that's inserted into a separate cup, which is inserted into the case. You don't have to insert it into that cup. It's already at the factory. That's a typical 209 primer, but that's the reason why that brass head is there. It really has nothing to do with the strength of the shell. That shell is extremely strong and made to put up with repeated poundings. It's stronger than the typical so-called high velocity shell, which is used in the field, because the high velocity shell used in the field doesn't really need to be too strong. What it needs to do is to turn into dust. This so-called brass base is really not brass at all. It's steel and it's brass plated so that it will quickly corrode out in the elements. And you can see the corrosion is already evident on this old shell right here. This has been around for quite a number of years. So this is already evidently, just in the storage in my house, it's shown evidence of corrosion. So they're made to deteriorate. And the plastics are inferior plastics, which are designed to react to the elements and the ozone and the atmosphere and everything, so that they break down, so that these shells just simply don't last very long out in the fields and marshes. So Contrary to what a lot of people think, high brass shells are really not stronger. They're actually made strong enough for the circumstances that occur inside the case, for the pressures, to retain the pressures that are necessary, but they're actually made to break down quite quickly in the elements. So that's what you want to do, is you want to have a good 1 1/8 load in your 12 gauge shotgun. 1 ounce loads, a lot of people use 1 ounce loads for skeet shooting, because skeet shooting is a lot closer. The birds are flying right over your head, and they're right out from the house, they're either coming out from the house above you or beside you, and you're shooting at them as they're very close, or they're coming at you and from the other house, or you're standing out in the middle and they're going both ways over you. So it's all close range shooting. So some people use just 1 ounce of shot in those circumstances with the same velocity, but with number 8s in order to get the pellet count way up, and to throw, and they use skeet chokes, which throw the pellets wide open as possible. And after you get done with all your practicing, you're going to say, gee, I wonder if I should get myself a bunch of 3-inch magnums or 3.5-inch magnums or whatever. Well, unless you're a duck hunter or a goose hunter and you're using non-toxic shot, there's really no need. There's really no advantage, because for the upland bird hunter, you really don't need to have the additional number of pellets that is involved with a non-toxic shot, and all those things really are not necessary, and you certainly don't need the heavy velocities that are incorporated into those shells. In order to keep velocity and penetration up with non-toxic shells, which I'll talk about later, it's necessary to drive them at velocities that are much, much higher than even the high velocity lead loads. So 2 3/4 inch is more than sufficient for anything. And lighter payloads, most experienced gunners, with the exception of pheasant hunting that goes out in the wide open fields where you need to stretch out, in most cases, most hunters find that lighter loads, 1 1/4 loads, or maybe even maximum of 1 3/8 is more than enough for any kind of upland shooting. Myself, I prefer just 1 1/8 for any upland shooting. That's more than enough. I mean, if I can't get my partridge when he's busting out of an apple orchard at 25 or 30 yards, he's already gone, because he's already put an apple tree between me and him. So at that range, the pattern density is more than sufficient with even an ounce of shot. So, but I like to have somewhat larger pellets, like number 6s, in order to get in deeply. So keep those little factoids in mind, that as your pellet count, as your pellet size goes up in size, your energy is increased, but your pellet count goes down. And you can see how many pellets. There are charts that will tell you, that Lyman book will tell you exactly how many pellets there are in a given ounce, or a different weight of charge and things like that. But if you just simply go to the store and arm yourself with this basic information, you can pick out the appropriate loads. If you're hunting in the woods, anything in the mid 1200s velocity is more than sufficient. If you're hunting out in the cornfields, you want to have as high a velocity as you can, until you become familiar with your shooting style. If you're a gunner that happens to be very quick on the draw, and you can get those pellets downrange quickly, you may not want to have some of the heavier loads, because you may be loading up your dinner fare that night with a lot of lead. So that's it. In the next episode, we'll talk about some of the other features of a shotgun, the longer chambers, the non-toxic shot shells, and things of that sort. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, God bless.